The sun hung mercilessly over Red Vale, casting long shadows across the dusty main street where decent folks minded their own business. But on this particular Tuesday afternoon, decency took a back seat to something far more sinister. Cowboy had ridden into town with nothing more than selling his cattle on his mind. At 43, he'd learned to keep his head down and his business simple. 20 years of solitary living on his ranch had taught him that the fewer people you trusted, the fewer times you'd get burned. His weathered hands gripped the reins as his horse, Thunder, clip-clopped down Main Street toward the livestock market. That's when he saw them. Two small figures stood in the town square, burlap sacks covering their heads, their tiny hands bound with rough rope. A man in a tattered black coat was addressing a small crowd that had gathered, his voice carrying across the square like a snake's hiss. "Fresh orphans, folks. Strong backs, willing workers. The boy's about 10, the girl maybe 8. Perfect age for training, if you know what I mean." Cowboy's blood ran cold. In all his years in the West, he'd seen plenty of cruelty, but this was something else entirely. Children being sold like livestock in broad daylight, and the townspeople were actually considering it. He dismounted Thunder and pushed through the crowd, his spurs jingling with each determined step. The closer he got, the more his heart sank. The children were trembling, their small bodies shaking beneath thin, dirty clothes. The girl was whimpering softly, a sound that cut through Cowboy's hardened exterior like a hot knife through butter. "What's the asking price?" Cowboy heard himself say, though every fiber of his being screamed against participating in this nightmare. The seller, a gaunt man with yellowed teeth and dead eyes, grinned. "Smart man, I can see you know quality when you see it. $200 for the pair, or $125 each." Cowboy's hand instinctively went to his vest pocket where he kept his money. He'd brought exactly $130 to town, enough for supplies and maybe a decent meal. His heart hammered as he realized he could only afford one child. The crowd was getting restless. A burly man in overalls stepped forward, counting bills. "I'll take the boy for farm work," he announced. "No!" The word exploded from Cowboy's lips before he could stop it. Every eye in the square turned to him. The seller's grin widened. "Looks like we got ourselves a bidding war, folks." Cowboy's mind raced. He couldn't let these children be separated and sold to God knows what kind of fate. But he also couldn't afford both. The weight of an impossible choice pressed down on him like a mountain. "I'll take the girl," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. $125. The seller's eyes lit up with greed. "Sold. But you better hurry, mister. That boy's gonna be gone in about 2 minutes." As Cowboy counted out his money with shaking hands, he heard the girl sob softly. When he gently removed the burlap sack from her head, he found himself looking into the most frightened brown eyes he'd ever seen. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with tangled auburn hair and a face streaked with tears and dirt. "It's okay, little one," he whispered, trying to keep his voice steady. "You're safe now." But even as he said the words, he knew they weren't entirely true. Behind them, he could hear the burly man completing his purchase of the boy. The sound of another burlap sack being removed, followed by a young voice crying, "Emma! Emma!" made Cowboy's stomach turn. The girl in his arms suddenly came alive, struggling against him. "Tommy! That's my brother! Please, mister, don't let them take Tommy!" Cowboy turned to see the boy being dragged away, his small hand reaching desperately toward his sister. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same auburn hair, the same brown eyes, now filled with terror and confusion. "Wait!" Cowboy called out, but the burly man was already loading the boy onto a wagon. "I'll buy him too! Name your price!" The man laughed harshly. "Too late, friend. This boy's mine now. Got work for him at my place up north. Won't be seeing him again any time soon." As the wagon disappeared in a cloud of dust, Emma's cries echoed through the square. The crowd began to disperse, their entertainment over, leaving Cowboy standing alone with a heartbroken little girl and the crushing weight of what he'd just witnessed. The seller pocketed his money and tipped his hat mockingly. "Pleasure doing business with you, Cowboy. Don't worry about the boy. He'll learn to forget he ever had a sister." With that, the man melted into the crowd, leaving no trace of his identity or where he'd come from. Cowboy looked down at Emma, whose sobs had quieted to soft whimpers, and made a promise that would change both their lives forever. "I'm going to find your brother, Emma. I don't know how, but I'm going to bring Tommy back to you." As they walked toward Thunder, Cowboy couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger and more dangerous than a simple rescue mission. The way the townspeople had watched the sale with such casual indifference, the seller's confidence, the buyer's quick departure, it all felt orchestrated, like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't yet see. But one thing was certain: he'd made his choice, and now he'd have to live with the consequences. The question was, how far was he willing to go to make things right? 3 days had passed since the horrific scene in Red Vale's town square, and Cowboy hadn't slept more than a few hours total. Emma sat quietly on his front porch, staring down the dusty road as if willing her brother to appear. She'd barely spoken since he'd brought her to his ranch, only whispering "Tommy" whenever she thought Cowboy wasn't listening. The ranch house, which had felt like a sanctuary for 20 years, now felt like a prison. Every creak of the floorboards reminded him of the choice he'd made, and every time he looked at Emma's hollow eyes, the weight of his failure pressed down harder. On the 4th morning, Cowboy made a decision that would either save them both or destroy everything he'd built. "Emma," he said gently, kneeling beside her chair, "we're going back to town. We're going to find Tommy." For the first time since he'd brought her home, Emma's eyes showed a spark of life. "Really? You promise?" "I promise." The ride back to Red Vale was tense. Cowboy had strapped on his gun belt for the first time in months, and Thunder seemed to sense the gravity of their mission. Emma rode behind him, her small arms wrapped tightly around his waist, her body rigid with hope and fear. Red Vale looked different in the morning light, smaller somehow and more sinister. The town square where the sale had taken place was now just an empty patch of dirt, as if nothing had ever happened there. But Cowboy knew better. Evil had a way of leaving traces, and he'd learned to read them. Their first stop was the sheriff's office. Sheriff Morrison was a decent man, but he'd been conspicuously absent during the children's sale. When Cowboy pushed through the office door, he found Morrison hunched over his desk, looking like he hadn't slept in days. "Cowboy," Morrison said without looking up. "Figured you'd be back. You know why I'm here, Sheriff." Morrison finally raised his eyes, and Cowboy was shocked by what he saw. The man looked haunted, his usually steady hands trembling as he reached for his coffee cup. "That business in the square," Morrison said quietly. "I should have stopped it, but I couldn't. Couldn't or wouldn't. Couldn't." Morrison's voice was barely a whisper. "You don't understand, Cowboy. That man, he wasn't just some random seller. He works for people who own half this town. People who could make me disappear just as easy as they made those children appear." Emma stepped forward, her small voice cutting through the tension. "Please, Mr. Sheriff, my brother Tommy, the man took him away. We just want him back." Morrison's face crumpled. "Child, I wish I could help you, but the man who bought your brother, his name's Jeremiah Blackwood. He owns a mining operation up in the mountains about 50 miles north. Uses workers who don't ask for wages." The implication hit Cowboy like a physical blow. "You're talking about slave labor." "I'm not talking about anything," Morrison said quickly. "And neither are you if you're smart. Blackwood's got connections that reach all the way to the territorial capital. Cross him, and you'll end up in an unmarked grave." Cowboy felt Emma's hand slip into his, her small fingers gripping tight. "I don't care about his connections, Sheriff. That little boy doesn't belong in a mine." "No, he doesn't," Morrison agreed. "But what are you going to do about it? Ride up there alone and demand he hand over the boy? Blackwood's got 20 armed men working for him. You'd be dead before you reached the gate." As they left the sheriff's office, Cowboy's mind was racing. He needed information, and he needed allies. But in a town where decent people were too scared to speak up, where would he find either? The answer came from an unexpected source. "Mr. Cowboy," a voice called from the alley beside the general store. "Over here." Cowboy turned to see a young woman, maybe 25, with intelligent green eyes and prematurely gray hair. She was dressed like a school teacher, but there was something in her bearing that suggested she was much more than that. "My name's Sarah Mitchell," she said, glancing nervously around the alley. "I teach school here in town. I saw what happened in the square the other day." "Then you saw more than most people are willing to admit," Cowboy replied. Sarah's jaw tightened. "Those children aren't the first ones that man has sold. Over the past 2 years, at least a dozen orphans have disappeared from the territorial orphanage. They show up here, get sold, and vanish. Nobody asks questions because nobody wants to know the answers." Emma stepped closer to Sarah. "Do you know where my brother is?" Sarah knelt down to Emma's level. "I might, sweetheart, but getting him back won't be easy." She looked up at Cowboy. "Blackwood's mining operation is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole network of people involved in this, judges, politicians, even some federal marshals. They're using orphaned children as unpaid labor throughout the territory." "How do you know all this?" Cowboy asked. Sarah's eyes hardened. "Because my younger brother was one of the children who disappeared. I've been investigating this for 18 months, gathering evidence, trying to find someone with the courage to help me expose it." "What kind of evidence?" "Names, dates, locations. I know where at least 6 children are being held, including your Tommy. But I can't do anything with the information because everyone in authority is either bought off or too scared to act." Cowboy felt something shift inside him, a familiar feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It was the same sensation he'd felt during the war, when faced with impossible odds and a cause worth dying for. "What would you need?" he asked slowly, "to bring this whole thing down?" Sarah's eyes widened with hope. "Someone willing to get those children out while I take my evidence to the territorial governor. Someone who isn't afraid of Blackwood or his connections. And if we succeed, then we save not just Tommy, but every child trapped in this nightmare." Emma tugged on Cowboy's sleeve. "Please, Mr. Cowboy, we have to help all of them." Looking down at the little girl who'd already changed his life in ways he couldn't have imagined, Cowboy made another promise that would test every skill he'd learned in 43 years of hard living. "Sarah," he said, "tell me everything you know. It's time to end this." As the three of them huddled in the alley, planning what could only be described as a war against corruption itself, none of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows across the street. The man in the tattered black coat smiled coldly and disappeared into the crowd, already planning his next move. The game was about to change, and the stakes had just gotten much higher. The mountain trail to Blackwood's mining operation was treacherous even in daylight, but Cowboy had chosen to make the journey under cover of darkness. Sarah's intelligence had been invaluable. Detailed maps, guard rotations, and most importantly, the location of the children's quarters. What she'd told him about the operation had made his blood boil. Blackwood wasn't just using child labor. He was running a sophisticated slavery ring that supplied unpaid workers to mines, ranches, and factories throughout 3 territories. The children were kept in conditions that would make a prison seem luxurious, fed just enough to keep them working, and threatened with violence if they tried to escape. Emma had wanted to come with him, but Cowboy had left her in Sarah's care back in town. This was no place for a child, especially one who'd already been through so much trauma. But her parting words echoed in his mind as he approached the mining camp. "Bring Tommy home, Mr. Cowboy. Bring them all home." The camp was larger than he'd expected, a sprawling collection of wooden buildings nestled in a valley between 2 peaks. Flickering torches illuminated guard posts at strategic points, and Cowboy counted at least 15 armed men patrolling the perimeter. Getting in would be difficult. Getting out with a group of children would be nearly impossible. But Cowboy had faced impossible odds before. He'd spent the afternoon studying the camp through his spyglass, memorizing every detail. The children's quarters were in a long, low building near the center of the camp, surrounded by a wooden fence topped with barbed wire. 2 guards stood at the gate, but they seemed more focused on keeping people out than keeping children in. At midnight, Cowboy made his move. Using skills learned during his cavalry days, he slipped past the outer perimeter and worked his way toward the children's building. The closer he got, the more his anger grew. He could hear crying coming from inside the building. Soft, hopeless sobs that spoke of broken spirits and lost hope. The guards at the gate were playing cards by lamplight, their rifles leaning against the fence. Cowboy waited until they were distracted by their game, then struck like a ghost. 2 quick blows with the butt of his pistol, and both men crumpled silently to the ground. The door to the children's quarters was secured with a heavy padlock, but Cowboy had come prepared. A few seconds with his lockpicks, and the door swung open. What he saw inside nearly broke his heart. 12 children, ranging in age from 6 to 14, huddled together on straw mattresses. They were thin, dirty, and dressed in rags. When they saw Cowboy silhouetted in the doorway, they cowered in fear, expecting another beating or worse. "It's okay," Cowboy whispered, holstering his gun and raising his hands. "I'm here to help. I'm looking for a boy named Tommy. Auburn hair, brown eyes, about 10 years old." A small voice piped up from the back of the room. "That's me, mister. Are you here to take me back to Emma?" Cowboy's throat tightened as he saw the boy step forward. Tommy looked exactly like his sister, but his eyes held a weariness that no child should ever possess. His small hands were cut and calloused from working in the mines, and a purple bruise covered half his face. "Yes, Tommy. Emma sent me to bring you home, but I'm not leaving without all of you." The children looked at each other with a mixture of hope and terror. An older boy, maybe 13, shook his head. "Mister, you don't understand. They'll hunt us down. They always do. And when they catch us, they're not going to catch us," Cowboy said firmly. "But I need you all to be brave and do exactly what I tell you. Can you do that?" One by one, the children nodded. Cowboy quickly explained his plan. They would move in groups of 3, following a route he'd mapped out that would take them around the main camp and down to a hidden canyon where he'd left Thunder and 2 other horses he'd borrowed from a nearby ranch. The first group made it out without incident. The second group was halfway to the rendezvous point when everything went wrong. "Well, well, well, what do we have here?" Cowboy spun around to find himself face to face with Jeremiah Blackwood himself. The man was exactly what Cowboy had expected. Tall, well-dressed, with cold eyes and a cruel smile. Behind him stood 6 armed men, their weapons trained on Cowboy and the remaining children. "You must be the cowboy who's been causing so much trouble in Red Vale," Blackwood continued. "I have to admit I'm impressed. It takes real courage to break into my operation. Real stupidity, too, but courage nonetheless. Let the children go, Blackwood. Your fight is with me." Blackwood laughed. "My fight? Friend, you don't even know what you've stumbled into. These children aren't just workers, they're investments. Each one represents thousands of dollars in profits over the years. Did you really think I'd just let you walk away with my property? They're not property, they're human beings. In this territory, they're whatever I say they are. And right now they're coming back to work." Blackwood gestured to his men. "Kill the cowboy. Put the children back in their quarters. Double the guards." But as the gunmen raised their weapons, the night exploded into chaos. Sarah Mitchell emerged from behind a boulder, a smoking rifle in her hands and one of Blackwood's men already down. "Federal marshals!" she shouted. "You're all under arrest." The lie worked for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for Cowboy to draw his pistol and dive for cover, pulling Tommy with him. Gunfire erupted across the canyon as Blackwood's men scattered, some returning fire, others running for the main camp. In the confusion, Cowboy saw his chance. "Run!" he shouted to the children. "Follow the trail down to the horses! Go!" As the children fled, Cowboy and Sarah found themselves pinned down by superior firepower. Blackwood had taken cover behind a wagon, shouting orders to his men and promising a $1,000 bonus to whoever killed the interfering cowboy. "How did you find me?" Cowboy called to Sarah during a lull in the shooting. "I followed you," she replied, reloading her rifle. "Good thing, too. You were walking into a trap." "What do you mean?" "The man who sold the children in Red Vale, he works directly for Blackwood. They knew you'd come looking for Tommy. This whole thing was a setup." The pieces suddenly clicked into place in Cowboy's mind. The seller's confidence, the sheriff's fear, the way everything had seemed too easy. They'd been played from the beginning. But if this was a trap, it was about to backfire spectacularly. "Sarah," Cowboy said, checking his ammunition, "how much evidence do you really have on these people?" "Enough to bring down the entire network. Names, locations, financial records, everything. Then we need to get out of here alive to use it." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the canyon. But instead of more of Blackwood's men, Cowboy heard a familiar voice shouting orders. "This is Sheriff Morrison. Throw down your weapons." The cavalry had arrived, but the question was, whose side were they really on? Sheriff Morrison rode into the canyon with a dozen armed deputies, their badges glinting in the moonlight. For a moment, the gunfire stopped, as everyone tried to figure out whose side the law was on. Blackwood stepped out from behind his cover, his hands raised, but his voice confident. "Sheriff, thank God you're here. This madman broke into my property and tried to steal my workers. I demand you arrest him immediately." Morrison dismounted slowly, his hand resting on his gun. Cowboy held his breath, knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether they lived or died. "Jeremiah Blackwood," Morrison said in a voice that carried across the canyon, "you're under arrest for human trafficking, child endangerment, and conspiracy to commit murder." The words hit like a thunderbolt. Blackwood's confident smile vanished, replaced by rage and disbelief. "You can't be serious, Morrison. You know who I am. You know who I work for." "I know exactly who you work for," Morrison replied, drawing his weapon. "And I know they can't protect you anymore." The sheriff turned to his deputies. "Arrest every one of Blackwood's men. Anyone who resists, shoot them." As chaos erupted again, Morrison made his way to where Cowboy and Sarah were taking cover. "Sorry I'm late," he said. "Had to wait for the right moment." "What changed your mind?" Cowboy asked, still not entirely trusting the situation. Morrison's face was grim. "Got a telegram this morning from the territorial governor. Seems Miss Mitchell here sent him quite a package of evidence. The governor's sending federal marshals to clean house, and he wanted local cooperation." Sarah emerged from behind the rocks, her rifle still ready. "I sent copies of everything to 3 different officials, just in case. The corruption goes deeper than any of us imagined." "How deep?" Cowboy asked. "All the way to Washington," Morrison answered. Blackwood was just the local operator. The real power behind this trafficking ring includes 2 territorial judges, a federal marshal, and at least 1 congressman. They've been using orphan children as slave labor for almost 5 years. As Morrison's deputies rounded up the last of Blackwood's men, Cowboy's thoughts turned to the children. "Tommy and the others, are they safe?" "Safe and sound," Morrison confirmed. "My men found them at your rendezvous point. They're scared but unharmed." But Blackwood wasn't finished. Even with his hands cuffed behind his back, his eyes burned with hatred. "You think this is over, Cowboy? You have no idea what you've started. There are people involved in this who will hunt you to the ends of the earth." "Let them come," Cowboy replied quietly. "I've got nothing left to lose and everything to fight for." "Oh, but you do have something to lose," Blackwood said with a cruel smile. "That little girl you've grown so fond of, Emma, isn't it? Did you ever wonder why she and her brother were being sold in the first place?" Something cold settled in Cowboy's stomach. "What are you talking about? Those children aren't orphans, you fool. Their father is very much alive. In fact, he's the one who sold them to us." The words hit Cowboy like a physical blow. Sarah gasped, and even Morrison looked shocked. "You're lying," Cowboy said. But even as he spoke, he could see the truth in Blackwood's eyes. "Am I? The children's father is a drunk and a gambler who owed us money. When he couldn't pay, we offered him an alternative. His children's labor in exchange for his debts. He agreed without hesitation." Tommy, who had been quietly listening from where the deputies had brought him, suddenly spoke up. "He's telling the truth, Mr. Cowboy. Our pa, he said we were going to work for nice people who would take care of us. He said it was just for a little while. The betrayal was almost too much to bear. Cowboy had risked everything to save these children, only to discover that their own father had sold them into slavery. Where is he now? Sarah asked, her voice deadly quiet. Blackwood shrugged. Could be anywhere. We paid him $500 and told him to disappear. For all I know, he's drinking himself to death in some saloon in California. But Tommy stepped forward, his young face set with determination. I don't care what our pa did, Mr. Cowboy. You saved us. You and Miss Emma are our family now. Emma, who had been brought to the canyon by one of Morrison's deputies, ran to her brother and threw her arms around him. Tommy, I knew Mr. Cowboy would find you. As Cowboy watched the reunion, he felt something shift inside him. For 20 years, he'd lived alone, convinced that caring about people only led to pain. But these children had changed him. They'd shown him that some things were worth fighting for, worth risking everything for. Sheriff, he said, what happens to the children now? Morrison looked uncomfortable. Well, legally, if their father is still alive. No, Cowboy said firmly. I don't care what the law says. These children are not going back to a man who sold them into slavery. I agree, Sarah said, and I think I know a way to make it legal. She pulled a thick folder from her saddlebags. While I was investigating the trafficking ring, I documented everything, including the fact that several parents were coerced or threatened into giving up their children. That constitutes abandonment under territorial law. What are you saying? Morrison asked. I'm saying that any parent who willingly sold their child to human traffickers has legally abandoned them. The children become wards of the territory, eligible for adoption by suitable families. Cowboy felt his heart skip a beat. Adoption? Emma looked up at him with those same brown eyes that had haunted his dreams for days. Would you want us, Mr. Cowboy? Would you want to be our pa? The question hung in the air like a prayer. Cowboy looked at these two brave, broken children who had somehow found the strength to trust again, and he knew his answer. Emma, Tommy, he said, kneeling down to their level. I can't promise I'll be a perfect father. I've lived alone for a long time, and I don't know much about raising children, but I can promise that I'll love you, protect you, and never, ever let anyone hurt you again. Is that a yes? Tommy asked with a grin that reminded Cowboy of his sister. That's a yes. As the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, Cowboy found himself surrounded by his new family. Sarah had agreed to help with the legal paperwork and had hinted that she might like to visit the ranch sometime to check on the children's progress. Morrison was already planning the trials that would bring down the entire trafficking network. And Blackwood? He was on his way to a territorial prison, where he would spend the rest of his life paying for his crimes. 6 months later, the ranch that had once been a refuge for one lonely cowboy had become a home filled with laughter, love, and the kind of chaos that only children can create. Emma had started attending Sarah's school in town, while Tommy helped with the ranch work and showed a natural talent for handling horses. The trafficking ring had been completely dismantled, with dozens of arrests and convictions. More than 40 children had been rescued and reunited with loving families. Sarah's evidence had led to investigations in 3 territories and the resignation of several corrupt officials. But the most important change was in Cowboy himself. The man who had once believed that caring about people only led to pain had discovered that love, real, unconditional love, was worth any risk. As he sat on his porch one evening watching Emma and Tommy play in the yard while Sarah helped with their homework, Cowboy reflected on the journey that had brought them all together. It had started with an impossible choice in a dusty town square, but it had led to something he'd never dared to hope for: a family. The children still called him Mr. Cowboy, but now it was said with love rather than fear. And sometimes, when they thought he wasn't listening, he heard them call him something even better. They called him Pa. In the end, the loner cowboy had learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes, the family you choose is stronger than the one you're born into. And sometimes, saving someone else is the only way to save yourself. The sun set over Red Vale, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and all was right with the world. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.